In today's episode, we will share with you the most shocking punishments you never knew existed in medieval times. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of Top 10 Bizarre Torture Devices of the Middle Ages. Top 10. Judas' Cradle. If you know anything about Jesus Christ, you might be familiar with his disciple Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him to the Romans and was said to have hanged himself out of remorse. Now that makes for a pretty grim origin story for a torture device named after him. The Judas cradle is basically a triangular-shaped wooden block that has a hole cut out in the center large enough to fit a person's head through. Once a person is placed inside the hole, their hands are tied behind their back and weights are attached to their feet until they confess to whatever crime they were accused of. To make things worse, the executioner would then yank the ropes attached to the weights, hoisting the victim up into the air before dropping them back down onto the wooden block, smashing their head in the process. According to those who witnessed its use, the condemned would often beg for death by hanging rather than suffer through the pain caused by the Judas cradle. Number 9. Thumb crusher. Imagine if someone squeezed your thumb really hard right now. It wouldn't be very pleasant, especially if they kept it up for days on end. Well, during medieval times, people were subjected to the thumb crusher, a terrifying device designed to crush and break the bones in a person's thumbs. This device was mostly used against those accused of heresy or crimes against the church, and since confessions were the preferred way of obtaining convictions, many victims of the thumb crusher ended up confessing simply so the pain would stop. It's also possible that some innocent people were accused of crimes they didn't commit and then tortured into confessing anyway, just so the pain would go away. No. 8. The scaphism of the Greeks. The ancient Greeks were known for their many advancements in culture, architecture, and philosophy. However, they were also responsible for one of the most gruesome forms of punishment ever devised. This form of punishment was described by the Roman philosopher Pliny the Younger, who wrote about how the Greeks would sew the mouths of condemned prisoners, trapping them inside a hollowed-out boat with only a small opening left at the top. The prisoner would then be placed on a nearby lake and left to die of starvation, all while being surrounded by insects, birds, and animals that would feed on their exposed flesh. Although scaphism is no longer used, there are unconfirmed reports of a similar punishment happening in India in 2017, when a man was locked in a wooden box as punishment for stealing a motorcycle. No. 7. Blood eagle. When you hear the term blood eagle, the first thing that probably comes to mind is the heavy metal band. But long before the band released their debut album, the blood eagle was already a well-known form of punishment throughout Scandinavia. The punishment consisted of making a large vertical incision along the spine of a condemned person, breaking their ribs and spreading them apart to resemble wings. Salt or ash would then be poured into the wound to increase the pain. In some versions of the blood eagle, the ribs were also tied together with leather thongs to ensure they stayed spread apart. While the condemned person was still alive, of course. The whole ordeal would be carried out during a public execution, so everyone could watch in attendance. No. 6. Catherine wheel. There are many different types of wheels used in medieval times to punish criminals, but none were more fearsome than the Catherine wheel. This type of wheel consisted of a large wooden spoked wheel that had sharp spikes protruding from each one. The Catherine wheel was usually reserved for those who committed particularly heinous crimes, like murder. As you can imagine, there were three main ways that someone could be killed using this device. They could be rolled over, hung from the wheel, or even crucified on it. It's said that the Catherine wheel was invented by Saint Catherine of Alexandria, as she was known for her ability to break the wheels of chariots with her bare hands. The wheel became a symbol of her strength. However, there is no historical evidence to prove this claim. No. 5. Execution by ordeal. In medieval times, there wasn't always enough evidence to convict a person of a crime, so instead, people were often put on trial by ordeal, which involved subjecting them to a painful situation to see if they would confess. There were many different types of trials by ordeal, such as cold water, hot iron, and the balance scale. In a trial by cold water, the accused was bound and thrown into a river. If they were innocent, it was believed that God would protect them and allow them to swim to the bank safely. But if they were guilty, they would drown. As you can imagine, the other trials by ordeal were equally dangerous and unfair. Today, we look back on these events and shake our heads in disbelief. But during medieval times, Trials by ordeal were seen as a necessary evil to bring criminals to justice. No. 4. Broken thumbs. We've already talked about the thumb crusher, but another common form of punishment in medieval times was broken thumbs. In fact, breaking thumbs was so popular that it was done both as a form of punishment and as a means of torture to obtain a confession. If you're wondering how someone could survive with a broken thumb, you're not alone. Back in medieval times, medical science wasn't as advanced as it is today, so many people died from infections resulting from broken bones. Of course, if they did survive the infection, they may not have survived the next one. After all, hygiene was not a strong suit during medieval times, and open wounds meant that a person was vulnerable to all sorts of bacteria. No. 3. Pear of anguish. Do you love or hate pears? Well, either way, you probably don't want to be locked in a pear-shaped cage and lowered into a pit of spikes. But during medieval times, this was a real form of punishment, known as the pear of anguish. This device consisted of a hollow pear-shaped wooden shell, filled with sharp spikes. Once a person was locked inside, they would be lowered into a pit, sometimes as deep as 30 feet, filled with spikes. Now, if you're wondering how something like this could actually happen, let us enlighten you. The person would be hoisted up and down the pit using a crane, until eventually they would be impaled by the spikes. Depending on where they were hit by the spikes, they could be mortally wounded immediately, or left to dangle until they bled to death. Number 2. Stretching. One of the worst parts about being stretched to death in medieval times was that it was typically done in public, as onlookers would watch in anticipation as the condemned person was slowly pulled apart. Of course, the method of stretching varied depending on who was carrying out the punishment. For example, the Spanish Inquisition was known for using a special type of pulley system to stretch people to death. In this particular method, the victim's limbs were tied to ropes that were then secured to hooks. The hooks were then attached to a pulley system that was operated by 2 sets of wheels. By turning the wheels in opposite directions, the executioner could control how fast the victim was stretched apart. The whole process could take several minutes, if not hours, and the victim would eventually be torn apart completely. No. 1. Brazen bull. When you think of hell, what kind of torment do you picture? Perhaps fire, brimstone, and all sorts of creepy Well, in medieval times, people believed that hell was like a giant brazen bull, which was used as a form of capital punishment. Basically, this contraption consisted of a hollow bronze statue in the shape of a bull. Inside the bull, a fire was started, and the condemned person was locked inside. They would then be burned alive, with the heat coming out of the bull's nostrils and ears. Of course, this wasn't the only way that the brazen bull was used. In some cases, the condemned person was forced to watch as others were burned to death inside the bull. Perhaps the most disturbing part of all of this is that there is some debate as to whether or not brazen bulls were actually used. There are records of them being used during the Spanish Inquisition, but it's unclear how many people were actually burned to death inside them. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and a comment below. We'd love to hear what you thought. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an upload. See you next time.